You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 2nd of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme, Germany jitters again as the far right gains in state elections. A general strike called in Israel as pressure grows on the Prime Minister to bring the remaining hostages home. And does the Eiffel Tower of all buildings really require further decoration? And we'll hear from Ukraine's former Deputy Defence Minister Volodymyr Havrylov.
This war at this stage is about survival of Russia. And so it's up to them to decide if they want to live or if they are ready to die.
That's all coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. Far-right populist nationalist party wins state election in Germany. What could possibly go wrong, and so forth. Alternative for Deutschland have topped the poll in Thuringia, winning nearly 33% of the vote and run a close second in Saxony. AfD will probably, however, not get to govern as long as other German parties prefer to regard them from the far end of a barge pole. A state of affairs that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is doing his best to encourage, fretting that the AfD's success is, quote, ruining Germany's reputation. I'm joined with more on this by Suda David Wilp, Director of the German Marshall Fund's Berlin office. Suda, first of all, what was AfD's pitch in these elections? Was it the sort of familiar, faintly paranoid, conspiratorial, anti-immigrant stuff we've come to expect from them, or did they have something new to say?
Yes, you're correct. The fringe parties, the AfD on the far right, but also its counterpart on the opposite side of the spectrum, the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance on the far left, are demanding a stop to migration in Germany. They have also both bucked the mainstream parties when it comes to support of Ukraine. And they're also against Berlin's green transition and would frankly rather go back to turning on the natural gas from Russia again. And so these are themes that played particularly well in the former East, in the states of Saxony and Thuringia, but they also have resonance on a national level.
I mean, this East-West divide in German politics, which is extraordinarily rather durable, given that it's nearly 35 years since the wall came down, has been much remarked upon. But that being the case, does this represent any broad trend in Germany, especially that gathering of pace of anti-immigration, pro-Russian sentiment on the left as well, or are these just regional quirks?
So the scale of success for the fringe parties in the former East Germany is extremely significant and, as you mentioned, can be traced to a number of factors. There's a lack of party identification even after 3 decades since reunification, economic dislocation that's occurred in these areas, and sympathy toward Russia. But Berlin can't ignore the results and claim that these are just sort of distinct to a particular region, because all these campaign themes, migration, the green transition, and the support for Ukraine, are going to accompany the government in Berlin and the CDU, the Conservatives, in the run-up to the federal election next year.
As I was saying in the introduction to this piece, it does sort of seem like the tradition will endure of mainstream respectable parties not wishing to dirty their hands dealing with the AfD, which is understandable enough in any circumstances, perhaps even more so given Germany's history. But has there been any conversation anywhere in mainstream German politics about calling their bluff? This has sort of worked in a few other locations. You let the populists govern, it becomes usually fairly clear fairly quickly that they can't do it and they're not interested in doing it, and that sometimes rather lets the heat out of it.
So the AfD is definitely not your run-of-the-mill right-wing party in Europe. It's quite new. It's been around for a little over a decade and hasn't moderated, perhaps, as other parties in other Western democracies in Europe. You have the 2 states of Saxony and Thuringia, where the Domestic Intelligence Agency has labeled the AfD as extremist, and the leader of the party in Thuringia has actually been fined for using Nazi rhetoric. So I think that there's still going to be a firewall between the AfD and mainstream parties, but you hear also talk of, how perhaps can we work with them on a local level. I don't imagine the AfD playing a role in a federal coalition anytime soon, but their presence, along with the BSW, the party on the far left, have caused a lot of political fragmentation in the system. And at some point, there may be a need to work with these parties and bring strange bedfellows together just to have viable majorities in Germany. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of political instability. But for now, the AfD has definitely been ostracized by the mainstream parties.
Is there a sense, though, that the AfD absolutely thrives on this stuff? Because it's not hard to imagine what their response is going to be. They'll say, we won the election, and yet once again the establishment conspires to freeze us out the voices of the downtrodden common people, etc.
Yes, these announcements or these slogans are already being heard after the post-election parties that the AfD saying that there's, it's anti-democratic not to take us into account. We won 30% of the vote in Thuringia and Saxony, and they will also be in a position to have a blocking minority in these state legislatures. But, they may have won strongly in these two state elections, but overall, in Germany, they are a force to be reckoned with, but they're only polling at around 15%. That's what we saw after the EU elections in June. So they'll still be acting as a spoiler, but I don't think that most German voters are still actually aghast at the fact that there is this party on the far right. And businesses have also sounded the alarm because Germany is facing demographic decline and needs to attract and retain skilled workers. And business people are saying that that's going to be very hard to do with the AfD in these states.
Well, this, of course, brings us back to what Olaf Scholz has said, that he does worry about the effect that this has on Germany's reputation. And given all we've talked about, it's obviously very difficult for mainstream parties to contain or address or deal with a phenomenon like the AfD. But do we get any sense from his time as Chancellor that Scholz has any better ideas than anybody else?
Well, after the horrible attack in Solingen a little over a week ago, which probably also, had an effect, perhaps, we'd have to look at the exit polls for the votes in Saxony and Thuringia, where a refugee from Syria killed 3 people. I think that most of the mainstream parties have already announced that they want to be more hardline on migration. So you'll see an effort on the part of the coalition here in Berlin and also the conservatives demanding that the laws are just enforced, if not obviously adopting the populist rhetoric of the AfD and the BSW, but being stricter when it comes to deportation and curbing irregular migration. You're going to see an effort that the parties move in this direction because most Germans would agree that this is a problem in Germany.
Suda David Wilp at the German Marshall Fund. Thanks for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Here is Carlotta Rebello with the day's other headlines.
Thanks, Andrew. Police in Tunisia have arrested presidential candidate Ayachi Zamel on suspicion of falsifying popular endorsements. It comes as fears grow that prominent rivals to President Kais Saied will be excluded from the race. The Electoral Commission is due to announce the final list of accepted candidates later today, with the presidential election scheduled for October 6th. Mexico's lower house of Congress is debating a controversial judicial reform bill and is expected to pass the legislation later in the week. The judicial overhaul proposed by outgoing President Andrés Manuel López Obrador and backed by incoming President Claudia Sheinbaum has sparked a strike by judicial workers, strained relations with the United States, and spooked foreign investors. Romania's coalition government approved a draft law enabling the donation of a Patriot missile defense system to Ukraine. Romania, a NATO member since 2004, who shares a 650-kilometer border with Ukraine, said earlier this year that it would donate one of its 2 operational Patriot systems to Kyiv on the condition that allies replace it with a similar air defense system. And Myanmar's military government has announced it will conduct a nationwide population and household census in October. The move paves the way for a promised election next year as conflict continues across the country. Those are today's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Carlotta. Israel is today experiencing something akin, at the very least, to a general strike, following the weekend's recovery by Israel's military of the bodies of 6 more hostages murdered by Hamas. Since last October 7th, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has faced widespread criticism that the 251 hostages taken by Hamas during their attack on Israel were being sacrificed in favour of a military campaign in Gaza, a campaign which, according to Gaza authorities, has so far killed more than 42,000 people. I'm joined now by the Palestinian journalist Abir Ayoub. Abir, first of all, these are obviously not the first protests against Benjamin Netanyahu. Indeed, there were huge protests pretty much weekly against his premiership before last October 7th. Measured against those protests, how big has today been?
So the demonstrations this time is bigger than usual. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of people participating in the demonstrations, mainly from the families of the remaining alive hostages. And as we know that the demonstrations happened after 6 bodies of hostages were found. However, they could have been back alive, and some of them got their names on the list that Hamas approved earlier in July. So it felt like Israelis are losing more hostages. The more time is passing, the more hostages are being killed. And so far, after 8 months, only 8 hostages were rescued alive, and the number shrank to the half. Like we were talking about more than 250 hostages, and now it's likely there are less than 100 hostages alive. So that was the trigger for the large demonstrations. Also, the significant event that happened, that the police aimed to disperse the gathering by water cannon, stun grenades, and all these things that were not, familiar in the first protest. But how effective these demonstrations are going to be, this depends on how much they would last.
The idea today, of course, was that these would be more than just street protests. There was this general strike called by Israel's biggest labour union, Histadrut. Do we know how widely observed that has been? Have there been widespread closures of businesses, suspension of services, that kind of thing?
Yes, we are talking about 95% of the services were today out of service, and that the Israeli government is really concerned about the economy collapsing, because those who organized the demonstrations, especially the Histadrut, they aim to expand the strike to include more services. However, the labor court today just ordered the Histadrut to end the strike at 2:30. However, it was scheduled to end at 6 p.m. And at the beginning, it was until 6 a.m. tomorrow. So there is a pressure to end the strike. And as I said, it was comprehensive. It included a lot of services. It even included the hospitals, but the court had the final say.
I mean, it's of course not just over the last 11 months, but pretty much over his entire career that Benjamin Netanyahu has not been a massive fan of compromise or being shoved or bullied into things. Do we get any sense at all that his approach is going to change as a consequence of these demonstrations?
Apparently not, because now we are next month we are it's 1 year. We are getting into 1 year since the start of the war, and these hostages, their families were calling for their release since day one. And Benjamin Netanyahu thought that he could get them back by power rather than by negotiations, and he didn't show any real any sign that the strategy is going to change anytime soon.
Is it clear, though, because there have been talks on and off about these hostages, well, pretty much since they were taken, but in terms of the hostages that are still known to be in Gaza, as you said, it's slightly fewer than 100, although at least 33 of those are believed to be presumed dead, rather. Do we know actually what Hamas wants in return for releasing the hostages they still have?
Yeah, Hamas had names of the high-profile Palestinian prisoners at the Israeli jails, and apparently that was the challenge to reach an agreement between Hamas and Israel. Hamas wants really significant high-profile prisoners to be released, and Israel is not willing to release this large number of Palestinian prisoners with these penalties. So that was the challenge. Hamas thinks that they have the hostages, they have the strong card. However, it's getting weak and weak by more hostages being killed. And Netanyahu is not willing to compromise. So it has been the case for months now.
I mean, is it clear, just finally, why Benjamin Netanyahu has been so reluctant to compromise? Is it that he does think that there is a military solution to the specific issue of the hostages? Or is it that thing where he is beholden to the, very uncompromising far-right extremists he's in government with?
Well, according to analysts, Benjamin Netanyahu made it loud and clear that he wants to end Hamas rule in Gaza and he wants to get rid of Hamas forever. And he's doing everything he can to prove that he's not surrendering, he's not listening to Hamas demands. He would, he would let the army stay in Gaza as long as possible because we are aware that once the war is over, Netanyahu has a lot to be asked about regarding his dealing with the war file.
Abia Ayub, thank you very much for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. For the past month, Ukraine has been taking its fight directly to Russia through a surprise incursion into Kursk Oblast. And over the weekend, Ukraine launched drone attacks on Russia's own energy infrastructure and refineries. Yesterday, at the Globsec Security Conference in Prague, I spoke with Ukraine's former Deputy Defence Minister Volodymyr Havrylov, and I began by asking whether those weekend attacks on oil refineries were about reminding Russians that there is a cost to their war.
I think, first of all, it's about to reduce the potential as a supplier of diesel or something to the military. It's number one. They're very vulnerable now, the troops in Ukraine, with supply of everything to them. So we have to cut the logistic and we have to destroy as much as possible the stocks of gas, diesel and refineries as well. Also, it's a response to the efforts to destroy our infrastructure, electricity and others, which we face from 2022. And of course, it's a demonstration to the Russian population that Russia is at war. Then it's not about special operation, it's about war. And they are aggressors, they just step in another country. And people, they have to understand that real situation is not on the screens of the TV sets, but around the corner on the refinery, which is under fire now. But I don't think that influence on population is the number one priority during the strikes. Our priority is to destroy the capability to supply the troops with everything.
Is there, though, an aspect of trying to make it clear to the Russian public that they are at war behind the incursion into Kursk? Is that an attempt to demonstrate to the Russian public that, this is not a cost-free undertaking for Russia, that Russia is in some respects actually vulnerable?
Yes, first of all, we have to demonstrate them that they are vulnerable. So there is illusion, there is a strong air defense or something which is promised by the leaders. So the leaders, they always convince the people they have strong army, they have strong system of air defense, everything. So don't worry, just follow our course and everything will be fine. We demonstrate them. That's not true. They see the losses, and they see that every day, every night, attacks on the infrastructure, not civilian infrastructure, first of all related to military, but nevertheless it's a huge impact on the Russian mindset now.
Is part of this also about demonstrating to Ukraine's allies that Russia is vulnerable? Because there has been, of course, this tension for 2.5 years now of, as many Ukrainians have put it to us, we're being given enough to survive, but we're not being given enough to win. Is the Kursk incursion a means of demonstrating to those hesitant allies that Russia can lose this war?
Yes, it's all about the illusion that Russia is a strong military state. This illusion exists in the minds of the people in Europe and the United States for many years, from World War II. And so there is always a kind of very cautious attitude about invading Russia or something like that. And for the first time in the history from World War II, Ukrainian army, not big country, neighbor to Russia, stepped on the territory of Russia. And no response from Russia at all. Disintegration of the troops on the ground, lost command and control, and demonstration that there is no real power and strength on the ground in Russia. Yes, they can concentrate something on our territory, but they're not so powerful as they pretend to be. It's a huge illusion, and the Kursk operation is a very extraordinary demonstration of that. Nobody wanted to try it. Ukraine, we did it because we have no choice. We have to try all things, including coming to the territories because of some military considerations. We're at war. So that's a change of mindset in the Europe and United States about the potential of Russia, about the strength of Russia, about the real situation in Russia. And I hope it will contribute in a change of mindset in terms of support of Ukraine with something more powerful to just reduce that red lines of some long-range systems to be delivered and be used in the Russia territory to destroy the logistic which can be used by Russians to push us out of the territory. But our presence there is a huge also impact on the Russian population.
There is nevertheless a conventional wisdom that at some point this war will end in some kind of negotiated settlement, which does sort of presuppose that there will be some reward to Russia for what it has done, not just in the last 2.5 years, but the last 10 years. Is it your contention that Ukraine can still win this war completely, that you can recover Crimea, that you can recover all of the Donbass, that you can return Ukraine to the size and shape it was in 1991?
The mood in Ukrainian society, and we have a lot of polls about that we have to fight as long as necessary to liberate our territories. It's a unique situation. It's good for Ukrainian nation building up. It's drama of course, for people, families, but it's phenomenon. I'm very just impressed with the energy which is inside the Ukrainian civil society, which is the source of the energy of this war. Military, we're instrument, because without that support from your back, from your families, from your society, no military can withstand this war. With the losses and other things. And also society contributes a lot with creativity, how to conduct this war. So sooner or later, inevitably, Russia will lose the tempo, they will lose the energy, they will lose the belief, and we will see, I hope, some very inevitable changes inside Russia, in the mood, in behavior, and everything. And they will collapse in some way inside Russia. But we have to press them, we have to demonstrate them that there is no military solution at all, and there is it's in this war now, it's not about survival of Ukraine. This war at this stage is about survival of Russia. And so it's up to them to decide if they want to live or if they are ready to die. So we are ready to assist them to live, but they have to leave our territory.
That was Volodymyr Havrylov, former Deputy Defence Minister of Ukraine, speaking to me yesterday at Globsec in Prague. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. And finally on today's show, municipal authorities in Paris have decided that the Eiffel Tower is to become the architectural equivalent of one of those insufferable people who continues wearing their festival wristbands long after the event has concluded. Paris's Mayor Anne Hidalgo has declared that she would like the Olympic rings affixed to the tower during the recent games to become a permanent feature. Well, I'm joined with more on this by Colette Davidson, a journalist based in Paris who often contributes to the Christian Science Monitor. Colette, what has the mayor said about this? Why does she want the rings to stay?
Yes, well, Mayor Anne Hidalgo has said that this is a way to kind of keep the Olympic Games alive and keep that heritage going beyond the Olympics. So while she has admitted that, this is not a sustainable how can we say solution, because the rings are actually very heavy. They weigh 30 tons. So if they are to stay in the long term, they're going to have to be replaced by a lighter version. But she has said that she has the agreement of the International Olympic Committee, and they're on board. And so for now, she's saying they're going to stay there.
I mean, the Olympics concluded only recently. The Paralympics are, of course, ongoing. Is there a perception, possibly, that the mayor is trying to milk this somewhat? Because the Paris Olympics, and regular listeners will know that Monocle Radio was there for them, were a tremendous success. It was a hugely enjoyable event. But is she possibly making too much of it?
I mean, yes, sure. There are critics who are saying she's kind of just trying to hold on to the moment a little bit too long, and that keeping the rings on the Eiffel Tower is not the appropriate way to do that. I mean, she has said that Paris is very proud to have hosted the Olympic Games, that Paris will never be the same, thanks to this event, and it's a way to kind of keep that momentum going and remember all that the city has gone through. But of course, critics are saying there are other ways to do that. Even regular Parisians are saying, maybe there's a better place for the Olympic rings. Maybe the solution is just to keep that Olympic cauldron that is still burning at the Tuileries Gardens as a way to hold on to the moment instead of affixing these rings to such, an iconic monument.
I mean, regular listeners, or at least those who heard our shows from Paris, will remember that there was a recurring theme among those Parisian guests that we had on the shows, which was that, nobody had wanted Paris to bid for the games. Everybody was horrified when Paris won them, and everybody had spent years thinking they were going to be a total disaster, only to discover that they were great and everybody was enjoying them. Has that sentiment actually endured, or have Parisians just gone back to being grumpy about everything?
I think some people are wanting to turn the page, but for the most part, you have people who regret not having been here for the Olympics, and so they're taking the opportunity to buy tickets to the Paralympic Games, not just for themselves, but for their children. We're seeing, this is the rentrée scolaire, so kids are back to school today, but I think this week you're going to see a lot of school children going to the Olympic Games, and these fan zones being full in the afternoons, and certainly this coming weekend, there's definitely a desire to kind of hold on to the moment or recreate that moment, that energy that we saw over the summer.
Something else that the mayor said, and I just wanted to run this by you to assess how optimistic she may be being. She said the French have fallen in love with Paris again. Do you believe that, or has she perhaps not been outside Paris much these last few weeks?
You know what? It does sound overly optimistic, but I think on this one, she's actually right. I think a lot of Parisians sort of allowed themselves to feel joyful and enthusiastic in regards to the Olympic Games. And now, of course, we're back to reality, back to school, back to the political crisis in France, where we're looking for a new prime minister. And there's certainly going to be a lot of critics and, chaos this week as we look towards that decision. But the Paralympic Games are a way to kind of keep that energy going, and I think that we're going to be pleasantly surprised if we see some of these outdoor events taking place over the weekend and today. the crowds, they're not the same as over the Olympic Games during the summer, but there's certainly quite a lot of energy out there.
Colette Davidson in Paris, thank you for joining us. That is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Carlotta Rebello, our researcher was Sana Jumani, and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing returns tomorrow at the same time, midday London. I'm Andrew Muller. Thanks for listening.